Hello and welcome to week 12. Week 12. We're going right along in research methods here. So, week 12 moves from last week's content on experiments to a unique but somewhat problematic experiment method called quasi-experimental method. Now, let me say this. Experimental method ideally says that if you want to test something, you have two groups. One's going to get the treatment, one's going to get a sugar pill, kind of thing. And they go through the same processes, then you measure the difference on the other end, then you get to know specifically the difference between the group that took the real medicine and the one that took the placebo. Now, a true experimental group, you'd have a whole selection of people for your sample, and you would randomly assign them to each one of those groups. Okay, so that everybody that you're looking at has an equal opportunity to be in the experimental group or the control group. Now, when we are looking at quasi-experimental, what we're looking at is membership in the groups is not random. A great example of this, to get a deep understanding, this very simple understanding, would be, let's say we wanted to measure the effectiveness of a medication on men versus women, biological men versus biological women. Sex difference. Classic study. Now, we have all these people, and in a true experiment, you would randomly select people and assign them to the male-female. Wait, that doesn't make any sense, does it? You can't do that. The individual comes in already with a trait that already designates which group they're going to be in. So, technically, it is not a true experiment because you do not have that random placing in the groups. So every time we are comparing categories, let it be sex, let it be gender, let it be race, let it be income, let it be any one of those things where we're looking at characteristics and we want to make comparisons to variations on that characteristic, we are in the quasi-experimental world. Now, our discussion for this week really focuses on quasi-experimental and a problem with some of our historical research that has built up the fund of knowledge that we have here in psychology. Currently, some of the early work that's been done in psychology, been doing it enough that some of that is now under question. Some of those classic experiments from years and years ago are not quite working out the same way now. Now, it is actually, in truth, very likely that humanity is changing. Our values are changing, our sense of the world, our multiculturalism, our differences are much more highlighted. We have communications, all of these things. People are different than they were years and years ago, and it's been long enough that some of those differences will probably appear in some of these traditional research findings. Now, the other part of that is, throughout the history of psychology, there has been an over-reliance on students of psychology participating in research. When I went to school, it was a requirement for people taking intro to psych that they had to participate in a certain number of senior projects. So the senior projects that were being done would recruit from the intro to psych classes. Whether those people were psych majors or not, didn't matter. Every one of them had to participate in the study. So when I was a senior there, it was easy to get people to participate in my study. They were required to knock off a few of these in that semester anyway, so I just put a sign-up sheet and people signed up for my experiment. It was pretty easy. Now, the problem with that is that group that category of people, undergraduate freshmen taking intro to psych, has had a huge influence on the results of experiments throughout the year, and maybe undergraduate students taking introduction to psychology are somewhat different than other populations in our world. So maybe the findings that we get are really, we can maybe generalize them to college undergraduates taking intro to psych, but we can't go too much further than that. Now, our sample is biased. Now, that whole question, that whole idea is currently on the table as the field of psychology is reinventing itself. It's reinventing itself in a number of ways. First, there's an ongoing acceptance of more qualitative studies as opposed to just quantitative. There's a reassertion of oversight in the use of statistics and data gathering to make sure that they're valid and people aren't cheating just to get good results. There's also a very upfront, including a public apology for the role that the field of psychology has played in sustaining racial inequality. There's a acute misrepresentation of different ethnic groups, different racial groups, and certainly women in the field of psychology. So there's an effort to right that wrong. And there's an openness to the reevaluation of some of the classic things that we have come to believe about the human experience through modern research, modern replication of those studies to determine whether or not those things still hold true. So here's the discussion. I want you to do possibly some research on this. Look it up, see what's being called out there in terms of the current issues that are facing the field of psychology and psychological research, and discuss what that means. For the discussion specifically says, what about this undergraduate thing about what can we say about all of humanity by only studying undergraduate students taking intro to psychology? Now, not all the work, obviously, and certainly this discussion has been going on for a long time, so there's a lot of modern work that doesn't use that paradigm. Many of your studies, however, are going to use that. Many of you are going to utilize the student body at KVCC, but the student body at KVCC is a little bit more diverse than undergraduates in intro to psych at traditional universities that are all 18, maybe 17, 18, 19 years old. Very, very different population. Okay, so with that, there's a quiz, and the quiz is simple. What is the difference between the real experiment and a quasi-experimental method? Putting that in your own words, not copying what I said, not copying what I say in the course book, looking it up, formulating. That's the big part. Formulating in your head, how do I want to store this information about the difference between regular experiments and quasi-experiments? If you continue along in this field, you will be doing both. You will be continuing to do those. There are times when you want to be doing quasi-experimental. It just loses a little bit of its statistical advantage because we don't have randomized placement into the groups. So, but it's the only way to look at differences between groups, or categories, as we would say. All right, so that's it. We have the discussion. We have the quiz on research methods. I will be reaching out to people who are behind in the research proposal process. We're not at the wire yet, but we're getting close, and that needs to kick up a gear. I need to keep up. Whoa, sorry. I need to pick up a gear and learn English. I need to pick up a gear, make sure that I am on top of these things every day so that you can get the feedback and move through. And you need to join me in that process, and let's get all of these projects ready for next semester. So don't worry about the specific due dates. It's where you're at and getting to the next one. So later today, actually, as I'm recording this, I know I'm going to be going in and finishing up the grading for those that have submitted them, and I'll be sending out emails saying, okay, now's the time to hit this and get this going. It's a huge part of the class. I don't want it to carry over into statistics. I want you to be able to get it done and have that ready to go. Statistics is enough to learn without having to design a study on top of that. So that's it for this week. We have the discussion, the quiz, and ramping up our attention to the special assignment of preparing for your research next semester. So I will see you online, and I will see you next time.